E. Cummings, born Edward Eston Cummings, was born on October 14th, 1894. He was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His father was a minister and a professor at Harvard. According to the textbook on page 608, he graduated from Harvard University himself in 1916, and he began writing poetry around the age of 8, and he is said to have written every day in between ages 8 to 22. In his early works, he really used the transcendental form of writing that we had previously learned about. Writing things about his relationship with God, and using things like prayers as inspirations for his poems. Next slide. This is very important. This is the historical context of a lot of Cummings' writings, and he lived for a long time, so he covered a lot of major events in his life. But one of the most defining moments in his life, in 1917, Cummings enlisted in the military to fight in World War One, and he was a part of the ambulance corps based out of France, and he would basically he would drive an ambulance and help with the wounded soldiers. And during his time there, according to his biography on the poets.org, while he was deployed in World War One, he didn't he wasn't excited about being at war. He didn't have this hatred toward the Germans, and that was looked down upon at the time, because you're at war with the Germans, and he is kind of looked at as treason. And that's what led this major event. Was for a few months he was actually held in a military prison while he was stationed in France. And when he got out of the military, which he was released from that prison, and when he got out of the military, you can go ahead and click to the next slide. This is where his most famous work. It's an autobiography known as The Enormous Room, and it kind of depicts, he talks about his experience in that prison camp while he's deployed. And in the textbook on page 207, there's actually a chapter 2, from The Enormous Room, and which I'm going to assume we will possibly be reading this week. I don't know, because this is Monday night while I'm doing this. And then if you wanted to back up to historical context, another thing that heavily influences Cummings is the Roaring Twenties. This is the time period after World War II where there's an influx in money and such, and just before the Great Depression. And this is a time period where Cummings has money, and he's able to spend all of his time writing and doing art. And in this, Cummings, I listed on the next slide as another major literary work is Buffalo Bills, which is a poem that's also in the textbook on page 609, possibly. I'm sorry, I'm flipping. It is on 611. I apologize. And the textbook has many great poems. I was already very familiar with E. E. Cummings, and I really like um, a lot of his poetry after World War One. During the 1920s, during this time period, you can see a lot of these on pages 609 through 617. And you can tell that he held a lot of contempt for the military after his experience, which, I mean, he didn't really do anything wrong except write some letters and express some opinions that he wasn't didn't hold any contempt toward the Germans. So you can understand kind of where he's coming from. And there's some language in some of these. And alright, so literary significance. Next slide. We are now on the fourth slide. Like I mentioned earlier, in his early works, he got to use that early transcendental style of poetry. But then through the 20s, when he had all that time, he got to kind of experiment and kind of make his own craft out of his poetry. And according to the poets.org, during this time, he really got to mess with form and punctuation and all kind of things to really express himself. And in that biography on him, the poet and critic Randall Jarrell once noted that Cummings is, quote, one of the most individual poets who ever lived, and though it sometimes seems so, it is not just the voices and exaggerations, the defects of his qualities that make a writer popular, but primarily Mr. Cummings's poems are loved because they are full of sentimentally of sex or more or less improper jokes of elementary lyric instance. But basically, they were just saying that Cummings was kind of breaking ground during this time period because all he's doing is he's writing poetry, and also I listed here just some accomplishments during his lifetime. He received multiple honors. I listed he won the Academy of American Poets Fellowship. He has 2 Guggenheim Fellowship Awards. He won the Charles Eliot Norton Professorship at Harvard Award, the Bollinger Prize in '55, and the Poetry Prize in Poetry in '58. And he won a Ford Foundation grant. And he was a very successful poet throughout his life, most likely while we're studying him now. And another very fun fact that I didn't know until I read this short biography that I read on the poets.org was that at the time of his death, which he died on September 3rd, 1962, which meant he lived a very long time, he was the second most widely read poet in the United States after Robert Frost. And after his death, he was buried in Forest Hills Cemetery in Boston, Massachusetts. Alright, thanks everybody for listening. My name is Andrew Ortega Harrow, and this is my presentation on E. E. Cumming.